Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about whether or not democracies have an expiration date. So I was reading through the 1776 report put out by the Trump administration yesterday that actually has since been removed now that Joe Biden is in office. But one of the interesting things that they brought up in that report was that republics traditionally don't last very long. And this is something that's known to be true, that our founders of the United States Constitution and the United States Republic knew to be true when they were designing it. Anyone who's a student of history or student of government knows that, traditionally speaking, democracies have been rare throughout human history, democracy even existing at all. And most of the democracies that have been established have not managed to last very long. We tend to think of this as something that maybe doesn't apply to us because there are so many functioning democracies throughout the world right now. And really, America is the shining example of the longest lasting and most successful democracy, I would say, that has been established. And part of the reason for that is probably because our founders knew. They had studied their history well, and in particular, they had studied the other democracies and the other republics that came before. And they had seen how it is that these regimes had collapsed, why they had failed, and the fact that they hadn't usually lasted very long. And so if you're going to set up a republic, if you're going to set up a democracy, you need to think very, very hard about this question, about whether or not there is an inherent way in which democracies tend to fall apart, and whether or not there is such a thing as an expiration date. General Sir John Glubb wrote an essay where he outlined a sort of theory about how empires fail. And in this, he posited that the average empire only lasts about 250 years. So if you're counting from the time of the founding, if you count the American founding as starting in 1776 up until now, America is about 245 years old. So we're right in that range right now, where we should be taking John Glubb's theory a little bit more seriously and asking ourselves this question of whether or not the democracy that we have has an inherent expiration date, and whether or not we might be approaching it right now. One of the things that we should consider in all of this is thinking about the way that our founding fathers thought about the universe, right? The metaphysical underpinnings of the system that they were trying to create. So a lot of our founding fathers were deists. And what this means is that they believed in a God, but they didn't believe in a personal, intervening God who played a role in people's everyday lives. What they believed in instead was a God who sort of sets up the universe and then lets it kind of play out on its own. A watchmaker of sorts who sets the mechanism in play and then lets it sort of unfold according to the rules that have been set for it. And if you imagine that this was their worldview when they were setting up this system, then you can get some insight into the kind of system that they themselves set up, right? So if we think of a God, a creator, as someone who sets the world in motion and sets up the rules and sets up the playing field and then sort of has it play out according to how they have designed, then the founding fathers themselves were creating a regime in that vein. They were creating a regime where they would set up the rules, and because they're not going to live forever, they knew that the Constitution was going to need to outlive them, that the American Republic, if they wanted it to succeed, would need to outlive them. They would also not be playing a personal role in dictating the lives of their creation. They were going to create something, they were going to set it in motion, and then they were going to let it mechanistically play out over time. And so, of course, the question for any regime, whether you're a democracy or not, whether you're a democracy or a theocracy or a monarchy or even a communist regime, is always a question of longevity. You want your regime to last as long as possible. Maybe you want it to last forever. One of the ideas behind democracy is that you can create a regime which, through a method of self-correction, can continually renew itself, right? So the idea behind democracy is not necessarily that you're going to get the best or the most optimal outcome every time by having people vote on what it is that we should be doing, how things should be running, what decisions we should make during times of war, during times of pandemic, during all kinds of situations, even times of peace. The idea behind a democracy is that whereas with a hereditary monarchy or with a one-party state or with a dictatorship, you don't have any choice to overturn that regime. The idea behind a democracy is that you can continually renew the regime through elections. And it is the elections themselves, it is holding the regime accountable to the people that allows the regime to correct its mistakes and to continue to adapt and change to new environments so that it's renewing itself. And in this vein, we can think of a democracy not as a singular type of regime, or the American regime as one regime that was then set up and then set in play, but actually as a continually self-improving regime that changes every time the electors, every time the elected officials and the presidency changes hands. And so you can think of each new president, actually, which is topical for today, as a new regime change. You can think of each new Congress, each new Senate, as a new regime change. And you can think of these as little units of alteration to the regime, of course, and then every little vote that gets count is a new input into how you would like the regime to go and what direction you would like to go in the future. And so could you have a 1,000-year regime with this kind of system set up? You know, maybe the 245-year cap, the 250-year cap isn't set in stone. And maybe the self-renewal mechanism, if you get it right, could, in fact, change the way that empires rise and fall. You know, are we approaching a limit? Could this be the end in the next 5, 10, 20 years of the American regime? You know, is there some kind of hard limit? This is something that we should think about. We should think about it deeply. And another question that you might ask is, what is the nature of democracy itself? Some people think that democracy is synonymous with entropy. That is, by implementing a democratic system, you naturally are implementing or choosing to implement a system that will become inherently more chaotic over time. And the reason being is that simply when you have a democratic system, what you actually have is a sort of built-in mechanism of chaos. You have more and more people who are going to gradually over time participate in the creation and the recreation and the direction of the regime. Whereas if you have power held by only a few individuals, a handful of oligarchs, or a single-handed dictator and his sort of advisors, well, then they can sort of plan out and they can direct the regime in a long-term way, in a long-term thinking way that allows for preservation of institutions and conservation of norms. Whereas in a democracy, everything is always up for grabs, essentially, because the only real rule is the rule of public opinion. You know, the electors that we elect can choose to change the rules themselves of the regime. In theory, with enough votes, you can actually alter any part of the Constitution. You know, you can make an amendment, and if you get that amendment passed by sufficient legislators, then you can change even the rules itself. Now, we do this very rarely because the system that we have set up has made it very, very difficult to change the fundamental rules of our governing structure. But of course, there are all kinds of democracies that have a constitution only in name. They have a constitution, and it has rules set out, but the elected officials simply don't follow those. And so it is worth asking, what exactly is tying us to the system that we have set up? You know, maybe you could set up the most perfect system in the world. If you believe, for example, that the founding documents of the United States are the best pieces of governance ever produced, that's certainly up for question. Maybe they're the best republic ever produced, or maybe they constitute the best democracy ever produced. We'll see. You can have those rules simply not be followed. And of course, you can always go one step further in this and simply define the best regime ever conceived as that which doesn't subvert its own rules. But then, of course, if you're optimizing for maintaining the rules, then you're not optimizing for change. And so there's always this delicate balance between how do we preserve what we have that's good and how do we change when circumstances change, because circumstances are always changing. And so I think really the solution to this, if we're going to continue to have a democracy and it's going to continue to survive these shocks to the system, these changes, the new landscape that we're in that no one that was alive when it was set up could have ever predicted, with technology, for example, with social media, for example, is to have thoughtful citizens. And that's a little bit of what I'm trying to do with this channel. I'm trying to encourage you all to take a more participatory stance in the democracy that you have. That is, if you're interested in maintaining it. I'll be doing more videos on this channel in the future where we're going to be exploring all kinds of other topics, different forms of government that might exist, different arrangements for governance, and really testing out these ideas that we have around democracy and whether or not it can work, whether or not it's the best system that has been set up, whether or not things could work better under a different system. These are all open questions. But today I wanted to focus on how long will a democracy last? And are we at the tail end of ours? What do you think? Do you think that this is the end of the American democracy? Do you think that this project, this experiment that we have, has played out? I know there are people watching in other countries who have their own systems of government. Most of them are democracies. Maybe you're reaching the end of your rope as well. People say a lot these days that the rise of populist movements of various kinds, whether they're on the left or the right, people leaning towards fascism, people leaning towards communism, are threatening the liberal order, are threatening democracy. And one of the things that we should always keep in mind is that democracy actually has within it the mechanism to uncreate itself. That is, you can vote for less democracy. A democracy can vote itself into extinction. This has been done before. And in fact, in most cases, democracies are not overthrown. They are themselves selecting to be ended. So let me know what you think. Do you think we're at the end? Do you think that empires, democracies specifically, have an inherent expiration date? Is there a period where it just doesn't go on any longer, where the watch breaks and we lose track of time, where the mechanistic systems fail? I think these are all open questions. And I think that as we continue to explore the future of governance together, these are important questions that we should ask ourselves. Till next time.